This is my true story. I spent my whole life working, hoping my son would care for me when my body grew weak. But one night, in his rage, he grabbed me by the neck and spit in my face. He called me worthless, like I was nothing. My heart broke, but I did not shout back. I stayed silent, because I already knew what I would do. You won't believe how I destroyed him. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so more people hear my story. I was not born into wealth. My life was built on struggle, sweat, and sacrifice. From the time I was a young man, I worked with my hands, breaking my body to make sure my son never had to live the same way. My bones ached from lifting bricks, my back bent from long hours in factories, my skin hardened from sun and rain in fields. Every penny I earned, I saved, not for myself, but for him. While others spent on pleasures, I spent on his school fees, his clothes, his books. I wanted him to walk into classrooms with his head high, never knowing the shame of poverty that I once carried. I worked nights so he could sleep peacefully. I skipped meals so he could eat fully. Every callus on my palms was proof of my love for him. When he reached the age of opportunity, I made sure doors were open for him. I paid for his university education, covering tuition that I could barely afford. When he failed classes or wasted time, I paid again, never complaining, always believing he would find his way. When he wanted a house, I signed the papers. I dipped into my savings, sold parts of my land, and placed him in a home so he would never feel uncertain about his future. When he faced debts after bad choices, I stepped in again. I cleared what he owed, standing between him and ruin. I believed that is what fathers were meant to do: shield, protect, and sacrifice, no matter the cost. As he grew older, my body grew weaker. The years of labor had carved deep lines in my face and left aches that never went away. But I carried them with pride, because I thought one day my son would look at me and see the man who gave him everything. I thought he would honor me. I thought he would sit beside me in my old age, hold my hand, and say, "You don't need to worry anymore, Father. I will take care of you now." That thought kept me going through storms, through hunger, through sickness. I had dreams of a quiet old age filled with respect. I imagined mornings where my son would bring me tea, evenings where we would talk about his life, nights where he would make sure I was warm and safe. I imagined he would carry me the way I carried him when he was small. I thought love and sacrifice would return to me doubled in my final years. But what I gave became invisible. My sacrifices turned into his entitlement. He never thanked me for the house. He called it his own. He never remembered the debts I cleared. He acted as if he had built his wealth alone. He never thought of the hours I bled and broke myself. He thought comfort was his right. My son forgot the weight of everything I had done. He forgot the father who carried him through storms. Still, I held my tongue. Still, I prayed that respect would return. Still, I convinced myself that deep inside, he must remember the truth. I endured his coldness, hoping for warmth. I endured his impatience, hoping for gratitude. I endured his arrogance, hoping for love. But none of it came. What came instead was cruelty, sharp and merciless, from the very boy I raised with my broken body. Cruelty does not always come as a storm. Sometimes it begins as a shadow, small and quiet, slowly growing until it covers everything. The first signs were easy to ignore. A sharp word here, a mocking laugh there. At first I told myself he was tired or stressed or too busy with the troubles of life. But deep inside, I knew. Respect was slipping away. The boy I once carried in my arms, who once clung to me when he was afraid, was beginning to look at me not as his father, but as something beneath him. It started when I asked for small things. A glass of water, a little help to move a chair, company at the table. Once he would have jumped at the chance, but now he sighed, rolled his eyes, muttered under his breath. "You're so slow," he said when I struggled to stand. "You're useless," he muttered when I dropped a spoon. I pretended not to hear, but the words cut deeper than any wound. Each insult left a scar that no one else could see. He began mocking my body. My hands, once strong enough to build a house, now shook with age. Instead of holding them with respect, he laughed at the tremors. My steps, once steady enough to carry him for miles, now faltered. Instead of offering his arm, he called me weak. He even mocked my silence, saying I was dead weight, saying I was nothing but a shadow in his home. I sat quietly, swallowing the pain, because I still hoped. I hoped the boy I raised was still inside him. I hoped the cruelty was just a phase. But it grew worse. He stopped asking me about my day. He stopped caring if I had eaten. He spoke to me as if I were a stranger renting space in his life. He showed kindness to neighbors, laughed with friends, respected strangers. But to me, his father, he saved only his scorn. The house I built with my blood and sweat no longer felt like mine. It felt like a place where I was tolerated, not welcomed. I remembered the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the nights I carried him to doctors, the mornings I worked double shifts to buy his medicine. And now, when I coughed, he turned away. When I asked for help, he ignored me. When I tried to tell him stories from the past, he cut me off with a wave of his hand. I was not father anymore. I was a burden. Still, I prayed for change. I told myself patience could heal. I told myself love could return. I told myself no son could forget the sacrifices of a father. But as the days passed, his cruelty grew. The sharp words turned into shouts. The mocking laughs turned into commands. And one night, the shadow became a storm. The cruelty that once whispered would soon roar so loud that it would choke the very breath out of me. The night it happened is burned into my memory forever. The house was quiet, but his anger was not. He came home with rage in his eyes, a storm I could see before he even opened his mouth. I tried to stay silent, hoping my silence would calm him, but silence only made him louder. He shouted about small things, meaningless things, but his fury was aimed at me. I sat in my chair, my hands folded, my voice held back. I thought maybe if I didn't answer, it would pass. But it did not pass. It grew. In a moment that still chills me, he stepped closer, his face twisted with hate. His hands reached out, not to embrace, not to steady, but to harm. He grabbed me by the neck, his fingers digging into my skin, squeezing until my breath trembled in my chest. My body shook under his grip. My hands tried to push him away, but I was too weak. His strength overpowered me, the same strength I once fed, once nurtured, once prayed for when he was just a boy learning to walk. My vision blurred, my chest burned, and for a moment I thought my life would end in the hands of my own son. And then, through clenched teeth, he spat the words that tore deeper than his grip. "You're worthless," he hissed. "Nothing but dead weight." His spit hit my face, his voice thundered in my ears, and my heart broke into pieces I knew would never be whole again. The boy I raised, the child I gave everything to, the man who lived under the roof I built, he stood there strangling me, spitting on me, and calling me nothing. When he finally let go, I collapsed into the chair, gasping for air, my neck burning where his hands had been. I touched the bruises forming under my skin and felt not only pain, but shame. Shame that my son, my blood, my only hope in old age, had turned into my tormentor. I looked at him, but there was no regret in his eyes, no sorrow, no shame, only coldness, as if I truly was worthless to him. That moment was more than cruelty. It was betrayal. It was the breaking of every bond between father and son. I had carried him when he was helpless, and now he had tried to crush me when I was weak. I had fed him when I was hungry, and now he spit on me when I was old. I had given him everything, and now he gave me nothing but pain. I sat in silence that night, my breath shallow, my heart heavy, my dignity torn. But as the pain throbbed in my neck, something else began to rise. A fire, a resolve, a decision. He thought I was worthless, but he would soon learn that the man he nearly strangled was still the man who owned it all. He thought his violence would silence me forever, but it only gave me a louder voice, one that would speak in a courtroom, one that would take back everything he thought was his. I sat alone that night, my body weak, my neck bruised where his fingers had pressed into me. Each time I touched the marks, a fresh wave of humiliation swept over me. I tried to swallow, but even swallowing hurt. The pain was not only in my throat, it was in my heart, in my soul, in the deepest part of me that once believed my son would protect me. My breath was shaky, not from sickness, but from betrayal. I looked around the house, at the walls I built, the roof I paid for, the furniture I bought, and I realized I no longer belonged there. The house was mine on paper, but it felt like a prison built from my own sacrifices. I remembered the nights when he was young, when storms shook the sky and thunder rattled the windows. He would run to me, crying, his small arms reaching for safety. I would hold him close, press his head against my chest, and tell him he was safe, that I would never let harm touch him. I remembered when he was sick, when fever burned his body, and I stayed awake, wiping his forehead, whispering prayers, refusing to rest until he was better. I remembered every moment I stood as his shield against the world, and now, that same boy had become the very storm, the very harm, the very monster I once promised to protect him from. The shame was heavier than the pain. To be grabbed by the neck by my own blood, to hear the word worthless thrown at me like a curse, to feel spit on my face from the son I gave my life to. It crushed me. I felt like the years of labor, the nights of hunger, the endless sacrifices had been erased in an instant. All those decades of love reduced to nothing by the grip of his hands and the cruelty of his mouth. As I tell you this story, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to my God, and I've seen it with my own eyes. When strength fades, respect disappears. One stumble, one fall, and suddenly they call you weak, a burden. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide for seniors. It's not fitness, it's protection. Just 10 minutes a day to stay steady, stay safe, and keep your independence. Download it now. The link is right below in the description. Yet I sat in silence. I did not shout. I did not strike back. I did not cry out to neighbors or plead with relatives. My silence was not weakness, though he believed it was. My silence was survival. My silence was the seed of something stronger. I knew that if I spoke too soon, my voice would be lost in the storm of his arrogance. But if I waited, if I gathered my strength, if I prepared, my silence would one day roar louder than his violence. That night, I understood something I had not seen before. He thought he had broken me, but all he did was reveal himself. He showed me who he truly was. He showed me what he had become. And he showed me what I needed to do. I realized then that the boy I raised was gone. What stood before me was a man blinded by greed, drunk on arrogance, poisoned by power. He had forgotten respect, forgotten gratitude, forgotten love. And I could no longer wait for him to remember. The bruises on my neck were not just marks of pain. They were evidence. They were proof. They were the tools that would one day turn the tables. While he laughed, thinking he had silenced me, I sat in quiet determination. He thought his violence was the end of me, but I knew it was only the beginning of his downfall. He thought grabbing my neck made him stronger than me. He thought spitting on my face and calling me worthless erased my life. He thought his rage gave him control. But what he forgot is that real power is not in fists or in cruel words. Real power is in paper. Real power is in signatures. Real power is in deeds, accounts, and rights that no violence can erase. He forgot that while he stood above me, choking me with his hands, I was still the one who held everything beneath him. The house he lived in, it was not his. The roof over his head, the walls that sheltered him, the land it stood on, all were still in my name. My hand had signed those papers years ago, and those papers had never changed. He thought it was his home, but legally, it was mine. He thought locking me in a room or dragging me out of one would make me powerless, but every lock in that house still belonged to me. Every stone was laid with the sweat of my labor. He forgot that. The accounts he bragged about, the money he spent, the wealth he flashed to neighbors, none of it was his. My name was on those accounts. My signature was the one the bank respected. He could laugh at me in the house, but in front of the law, in front of the world, my name still held the weight. He forgot that. The documents in my drawer, the papers tucked away, the evidence of ownership that he never bothered to look at. They were mine. He thought time had taken everything from me, that age had stripped me of strength, that weakness meant worthlessness. But what he forgot is that I had built everything with my hands, and I had kept everything under my control. His arrogance blinded him. He thought cruelty made him king, but cruelty only made him foolish. That night, as my bruises throbbed, I realized something. He had tried to crush me with his violence, but in doing so, he gave me the very reason to rise. He gave me proof. He gave me cause. He gave me the weapon I needed. Not a weapon of fists, but a weapon of law. The marks on my neck were not just wounds, they were evidence. And the deeds, the accounts, the papers were not just property, they were power. He thought he had silenced me, but he had only made me louder. He thought he had destroyed me, but he had only armed me. He thought he had ended my dignity, but he had only awakened it. The power he forgot was not hidden. It was always there, resting quietly in my hands. And soon, that power would be used against him. Soon, the law he thought would never touch him would strip him of everything. Soon, the son who called me worthless would stand in front of strangers and hear the truth of his cruelty laid bare. And when that day came, he would know. The man he nearly strangled was still the man who owned it all. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his hands around my neck. I heard his words again and again. Worthless, I saw his face twisted in anger, not regret. I touched the bruises, and each throb reminded me of what he had done. I sat in silence, but the silence inside me was no longer weakness. It was resolve. I had given him everything, my strength, my youth, my money, my love. And this was how he repaid me. A father who spent decades building his son's future was now treated worse than an enemy. Something inside me broke that night. But something else rose. The man he thought he had destroyed decided to rise again. I told myself I would no longer wait for respect to return. I would no longer pray for kindness that would never come. I would no longer give love to a heart that turned to stone. Enough was enough. My bruises were not just wounds, they were proof. Proof that the world needed to see. Proof that his arrogance had crossed a line. Proof that the son I had carried in storms had become the storm himself. And storms must be faced, not endured. So I made my decision. I would take him to court. I would not whisper my pain in corners. I would not hide my humiliation behind walls. I would stand in front of the world, in front of a judge, in front of strangers, and I would show them what my son had done. I would tell the truth, plain and clear, without fear. He thought my silence meant surrender, but my silence was only waiting for the right stage. That stage would be the courtroom. It was not easy to decide. My heart still wanted to remember the boy he once was, the boy who clung to my leg, the boy who called me father with love in his voice. But the man he became had killed that boy. The man he became had strangled him out of existence. And so I chose to face him not as a father to a son, but as a man to his abuser. If he wanted to treat me as worthless, then I would show him what worth really looked like. Worth is not in strength of hands or loudness of voice. Worth is in truth. Worth is in justice. Worth is in dignity. That night I whispered to myself, "It ends now. No more begging. No more silence without purpose. No more endurance without action. Tomorrow I would gather my evidence. Tomorrow I would begin the path that would strip him of everything he thought was his. Tomorrow I would take the first step into court, not as a broken old man, but as a father reclaiming his dignity." My decision was final. My resolve was steel. The world would hear what he had done, and when they did, his arrogance would collapse like dust in the wind. The morning after my decision, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not only the bruises on my neck, but the truth written across my face. These marks were not signs of weakness. They were proof of his cruelty. They were weapons, sharper than any blade. I touched them gently, and instead of shame, I felt strength. I knew what had to be done. So I began to collect everything, piece by piece, building the case that would strip him of his pride. First, I went to the doctor. My neck still throbbed, the skin dark with bruises where his hands had pressed down. The doctor examined me, took notes, and wrote a report. The words were clinical, but behind them was the truth of my suffering. Bruising consistent with strangulation, the report read. Those words would speak louder than my voice in the courtroom. They would show the judge exactly what his hands had done. Next, I asked the doctor for photographs. The camera flashed, capturing the marks in cold detail. The purple lines around my throat, the swelling, the evidence of violence no one could deny. Each photo was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Each photo said to the world, "This happened, and it was done by him." Then I went to neighbors. Some had heard the shouting that night. Some had seen me step outside, gasping for air, clutching my throat. Their eyes told me they already knew something was wrong. When I asked them for statements, they nodded, some with sadness, some with quiet anger at what they had witnessed. "We heard him yelling at his father," one said. Another added, "We saw the old man shaking after he came outside." Their words, simple but true, became arrows pointed straight at his pride. I gathered every piece of paper, every photo, every word. I placed them into a folder, the same kind of folder I once used to hold his school certificates, his report cards, his achievements. Back then, I carried his future in those papers. Now, I carried his downfall. The irony was not lost on me. The father who once saved proof of his son's growth now saved proof of his son's cruelty. At night, while he slept, I sat in silence, reading through the evidence again and again. Each report, each photograph, each statement strengthened me. He thought violence made him untouchable. But the law would see differently. The law would not look at me as weak. The law would not ignore the bruises. The law would not excuse his cruelty. And when the law spoke, it would strip him of everything. I remembered how he looked at me that night, as if I was nothing, as if I had no voice, no power, no worth. Soon he would see me stand before a judge, my voice steady, my evidence undeniable, my worth undeniable. Soon the same hands that tried to crush me would be empty, stripped of all they held. By the time I closed the folder, I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation. The evidence was ready, and so was I. He had tried to choke the life out of me. Now I would choke the arrogance out of him, not with my hands, but with truth, with paper, with law. The day of the courtroom arrived like a storm I had been waiting for all my life. I walked into that building with my back straight, my hands holding the folder that carried the truth. My body was old, my steps were slow, but my spirit was sharp, stronger than it had ever been. For the first time in years, I felt no fear of him. He had grabbed my neck in the dark of our home, but here, under the eyes of the law, I was not alone. Here, the truth had weight. Here, justice had ears. The courtroom smelled of paper, wood, and silence. People sat in rows, their eyes shifting from me to him. He stood across the room, dressed in a suit, his chin high, pretending to be calm. But I saw the tightness in his jaw, the restless movement of his hands. He thought he could talk his way out, that his arrogance would protect him. But arrogance does not stand against evidence. Arrogance collapses when the truth is laid bare. The judge entered, the room rose, and the case began. His lawyer spoke first, twisting words, trying to paint me as bitter, as confused, as an old man who had lost his way. They tried to make it sound like I had imagined everything, like the bruises on my neck were nothing, like I was weak and desperate. I sat quietly, my folder in my lap, my silence heavy, waiting for my turn. When it was time, I rose. My legs trembled, not from fear, but from age. Yet my voice, when it came, was steady. I looked at the judge, not at my son. I told the story as it happened. I told of the sacrifices, of the house, of the debts I paid, of the years I gave. I told of the cruelty that began with words, the mockery, the insults, the dismissal. I told of the night when his hands closed around my throat, when my breath faltered, when his spit touched my face and his words cut deeper than any knife. I told the truth, plain, simple, sharp. Then I opened the folder. One by one, I handed the evidence to the court. The doctor's report, clear and precise, describing the bruises consistent with strangulation. The photographs, showing the marks on my neck, each one a silent witness to his violence. The statements from neighbors, voices outside our walls that had heard the shouting, seen me stumbling outside, gasping for air. Each piece of evidence was a stone, and together they built a wall no arrogance could climb. The judge read, the lawyers examined. The silence in the room grew heavy. My son shifted in his seat, his calm mask cracking. He glanced at the photographs, then at the floor. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but his face showed the truth. Fear. For the first time, he was not the master. For the first time, he was the one cornered, the one exposed. I pointed at him then, not with anger, not with rage, but with the calm of a man who has endured enough. I said, "That is my son." He grabbed me by the neck. He called me worthless. He spat in my face, and he thought I would stay silent, but I am here, and I will not be silent anymore. My words echoed in the room, louder than any shout. The judge listened. The people in the rows listened. Even he had to listen. The lawyers tried again to twist the story, but the evidence was too strong. The photographs could not lie. The reports could not be erased. The neighbors' voices could not be silenced. And my bruised neck, though healed, still stood as a mark in memory and in truth. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. He spoke of duty, of respect, of cruelty that had no place in a home. He spoke of evidence that could not be ignored, of truth that could not be hidden. He looked at my son and told him he was guilty of violence, guilty of cruelty, guilty of dishonoring the very man who gave him life. He declared that the assets, the house, the accounts, the cars, all of it, would be stripped from his hands. My son, who once called me worthless, was left with nothing but the weight of his shame. I stood there, listening, not smiling, not gloating. Justice is not joy. Justice is not laughter. Justice is silence that finally speaks. I did not celebrate his fall. I simply stood taller, my dignity restored. The world had heard the truth. The law had spoken. And the man who once thought he could crush me had been crushed by his own actions. As the gavel struck, the case was closed. My son sat with his head low, his arrogance shattered, his future gone. People whispered in the courtroom. Some shook their heads at his cruelty. Some nodded at my strength. But I did not look at them. I walked slowly out of the room, each step steady, each step heavy with the weight of justice finally done. In that moment, I knew he had called me worthless, but I had proven my worth in the one place that mattered, not in his eyes, blinded by arrogance, not in the house, poisoned by cruelty, but in the court, where truth has power and lies collapse. That was the day the world saw what he had done. That was the day justice stripped him bare. And that was the day I walked out not as a broken father, but as a man restored. After the gavel struck and the judgment was given, the world that my son had built on arrogance began to collapse piece by piece. The ruling spread like fire through the town. Neighbors who once saw him as proud now spoke his name with shame. Relatives who once respected his wealth now knew that wealth was never his to begin with. It was mine. And the law had returned it to me. The man who once strutted down the street, laughing at others, mocking even his own father, now walked with his head low, whispers following him wherever he went. The first loss was the house. The very walls where he had dragged me, shouted at me, and placed his cruelty upon me were no longer his. Papers were signed, locks were changed, and the doors that he thought were his fortress became mine again. He had to pack his things, step outside, and watch as the roof over his head slipped from his hands. Neighbors stood in silence as he carried boxes to a borrowed car, no longer the master, no longer the man of pride, but just another man displaced by his own sins. Some shook their heads in disgust, some muttered that he had brought it upon himself, and all of them were right. Then came the cars. The same vehicles he once boasted about, polished and flaunted as proof of success, were taken one by one. Keys were surrendered, papers transferred. He who once drove fast with arrogance now had no wheels to carry him. He walked on the same streets where he once looked down on others, but now those same streets swallowed him in humiliation. People pointed. They whispered, "That's the one who grabbed his father by the neck. That's the one who spat on the man who gave him everything." His name became a curse, a warning, a lesson. The accounts were next. His cards stopped working, his checks bounced, his debts rose. The banks no longer listened to him. Every dollar he thought was his was stripped away by the court's order. He was left with empty pockets, his pride as hollow as his accounts. And as the numbers fell to zero, his arrogance fell with them. He had mocked me for being old, called me worthless, but now he was the one with nothing to show. The same neighbors who once envied his wealth now pitied his downfall. Some even avoided him, unwilling to be seen with the man who destroyed his own bloodline with cruelty. But the greatest loss was not money, nor house, nor car. The greatest loss was respect. Once, people listened when he spoke. Once, people nodded when he bragged. But now, no one cared. His words carried no weight. His pride had turned to dust. The story of what he did to me spread farther than the court. It spread into homes, into families, into whispers across town. Everyone knew, and everyone judged him not by what he owned, but by what he had done. As for me, I walked in silence, my head high, my dignity restored. I did not gloat. I did not laugh. I simply lived, free from his cruelty, free from his grasp, free from the shame he tried to bury me in. The papers, the accounts, the deeds were back in my hands. But more than that, my voice was back in my chest. I was no longer silent. The world had heard me. And my son, the man who thought violence made him strong, was left broken by the very law he thought would never touch him. The fallout was complete. His arrogance was gone. His reputation was gone. His wealth was gone. And all that was left was the truth. A son who raised his hand against his father lost everything, while the father he called worthless stood taller than ever. Justice does not always come with noise. Sometimes it comes in silence, slow and heavy, stripping everything away until only truth remains. My son thought he had broken me the night he grabbed my neck. He thought his spit, his words, his violence had ended me. But that night was not my end. It was his beginning of ruin. The courtroom became my voice, the evidence became my shield, and the law became my sword. He had called me worthless, but the judgment proved my worth louder than any words I could speak. When I walked out of the courthouse, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a man restored. My neck still carried faint marks from his hands, but now those marks were no longer humiliation. They were scars of victory, proof that even when a father is treated like nothing, he can still rise, still fight, still take back his dignity. People looked at me differently now. Neighbors who once pitied me now nodded in respect. Relatives who once doubted me now spoke my name with honor. And as for my son, he stood in silence, stripped of everything he once used to mock me. The house was mine again. The accounts were mine again. The cars, the land, the wealth, all returned to the one who built them. I did not take them out of greed. I took them because they were mine to begin with, earned by my blood, stolen by his arrogance, and now restored by justice. My son, who once sat in comfort while I ate in silence, now knew hunger of his own. He who once shouted that I was dead weight, now carried the weight of shame on his shoulders. He who once mocked my silence now lived in a silence of his own, abandoned by friends, avoided by neighbors, forgotten by the world he thought admired him. But my justice was not only about money or property. My justice was about dignity. The night he grabbed my neck, he tried to erase my humanity. He wanted me to believe I was nothing. But in court, in front of strangers, in front of the law, the truth was spoken. I was not nothing. I was a father. I was a man. And I was the one who built the very life he tried to take from me. The judge's ruling was more than punishment for him. It was restoration for me. It gave me back the voice he tried to silence. Now I live in peace. My days are quiet. My meals are mine. My nights are free from fear. I no longer wait for insults at the table. I no longer walk on eggshells in my own home. I no longer bow my head in shame. I sit with dignity, knowing I faced cruelty, and answered it not with violence, but with truth. My justice came not from fists, but from patience. Not from shouting, but from silence. Not from revenge in secret, but from justice in the open. And as for my son, he lives with nothing but memories of what he lost. He wakes up each day with the knowledge that he destroyed himself. He thought he destroyed me, but he was wrong. He only destroyed his own future. He will never escape the whispers. He will never rebuild the respect he threw away. He will never erase the truth of what he did. That is his punishment. That is his sentence. So here is my final thought, spoken not with anger, not with joy, but with the calm of a man who has seen justice done. He grabbed my neck and called me worthless. I stood in court and took everything he owned. Before I end, let me tell you, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to God. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide for you, so you can stay steady, safe, and independent. Download it now. The link is in the description.